Hey YouTube, Mikamu here with a tutorial of sorts. I just delved into the world of handheld emulators for the first time and have done a personal project syncing my ROM saves between multiple devices. I wanted to share that with the community, basically allowing you to seamlessly play games across multiple devices. This is between my Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, my AmberElec 351V, and my PC using Retroarch. So without any further ado, let's begin. So before we start, I want to give you all some context about what it is exactly I did. So basically, right now, the way my setup works is that my PC, my AmberElec, and my Retroid are all syncing to the same folder. So if I save a game on one device, basically that save file will be available to the other devices. And it doesn't really matter where I start the game from. This is all done through Google Drive. And a lot of these devices do have some tools for you to use. Obviously, there are multiple ways to do this. This isn't the only way. And there might be aspects of this tutorial that you may not want to do. I had to kind of go into the guts of my ArkOS config in order to make sure that the syncing was wireless. So at points, I'll call out things that you could do as alternatives to what I've done in case you don't want to do those things. There'll be timestamps as well, highlighting which parts are specific to which devices or which OSs, so you can know. You could basically skim through the video and look at the parts that are relevant to you in order to implement the setup that you want specifically, instead of, you don't have to emulate my exact setup. With that all said and done, let's actually jump into this. Okay, so we're going to first begin by setting up Retroarch on our computer. This will most likely be on a Windows or Mac device using Retroarch. If you have a RP2 Plus or AmberElec device, you likely already know what Retroarch is unless you didn't set up yourself. For those of you who don't know, Retroarch is most likely going to be the back end on your handheld emulator device. And so setting it up on our Windows or Mac system is going to be important to have save files basically be in the same format as they are on our personal handheld. And I'm personally using Google Drive to enable the syncing technology. So the second step of this phase will be installing Google Drive on, for me, PC or Windows, but it should be the same for Mac. Unfortunately, if you're using a Linux desktop, Google Drive's desktop client doesn't support Linux. So just keep that in mind. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm basically downloading Retroarch. If you've already downloaded Retroarch, obviously you can skip this step. And I'm going to quickly cut to where I'm installing Google Drive, so you can see what settings I'm using to push my saves on Windows. Sorry I skipped ahead. For those of you who aren't familiar with Retroarch or who need a refresher on how to install it, I'd recommend the video by Retro Gaming Core, a really great resource for learning what Retroarch is and basically how to set it up. Right now, I'm diving into Google Drive. I'm installing it onto my system, and I've now skipped ahead to when the download has been installed onto my device, so you can just see post-installation what the setup process is. So the first thing that will happen is Google Drive will request to sync with one of your respective Google accounts. So obviously choose the drive that you want to use to sync your files. Once that's done, you'll effectively have Google Drive on your device. The next thing you'll want to do is Google Drive is going to ask you basically, how do you want to set Google Drive up? Do you want to mirror all of your files from your computer to your Google Drive? Do you want to just have Google Drive display as a virtual drive on your machine? I selected that option to have Google Drive appear as a virtual drive on my machine. But there's also another option you're going to want to select here. What I'd recommend doing is basically choosing a set of drives on your computer to make the default sync folders. These specifically would be probably your save folder, your Retroarch save folder. That's what I'm doing right now. I'm going into where my default Retroarch saves are held and making that the drive I want to sync to Google Drive. So what that does is it means that you can have your saves locally on your Windows machine, and then when you are basically pushing them to the cloud, your handheld device should be able to pull that data and store it locally on that device. By default, RetroArch saves your game saves in a folder called saves. It's in the RetroArch directory. So that's the folder I'm using for this tutorial. If you want, you can make your default folder something else. And what I would recommend doing for ease of use with cloud storage is making your save folder and your save state folder one and the same. This will be across all of your RetroArch installations. Doing so basically makes things easier. Um, when you use certain types of syncing tools, which we'll go into later, they by default tend to push both saves and save states together. So it's just easier to have all that stuff in one folder, at least if you want everything to be automatic. Now, obviously, depending on how you like to keep your games organized, you may not like that. And we'll talk more about other options down the line in the video. Now, if your primary objective was just to sync, say, two Windows devices, say you have like a HTPC in your living room or something like that, and you have like a desktop where you have your primary like games stored, you're pretty much done. You just do the exact same steps on that other machine, and you're good to go. It could be a Mac to PC, it could be Windows to Windows, what have you. As long as they're desktop machines, and you could use the Google Drive desktop client to sync all your saves across your RetroArch instances. No fuss, really. Pretty easy. Now, I know there's some folks who, instead of a HTPC or whatever, they have like a RetroPie or a Raspberry Pi with Linux running on it. Unfortunately, my understanding is the Google Drive desktop client does not work on Linux. There might be some hacky way to get Google Drive running on those devices. I do believe they work with something called Arklone. We'll be talking about Arklone later in the video. But the tutorial here is mostly for these handheld devices and Windows and Mac mostly. So if you're looking for something specific to RetroPie, I know there's a script on GitHub that someone wrote to sync their saves from their RetroPie to their handhelds. I'll link to that in the description. But moving on, we're going to be talking next about setting up syncing on an Android device, mainly the Retroid Pocket 2. But if you have an Android device that you use to play games on, the setup should be pretty similar. That includes Android phones as well, not just handhelds. So feel free to adopt this next step for all your Android devices across the board. So the next thing you're going to do is on your Android device, you're going to go to the Google Play Store and download an app called AutoSync for Google Drive, also known as AutoDrive. And what this will do is it will allow you to basically push your saves from your device to the cloud, to the specific folders that you specified in Google Drive for your RetroArch desktop install. It's pretty much one-to-one, almost as easy as setting up Google Drive on your desktop. Pretty straightforward. I'm not going to actually walk you through all the steps here, but once you install the application, basically all you got to do is tell it which Google Drive account is associated with the folders you want to sync to, and then there should be a tab once everything's all rock and loaded on AutoDrive that points to your synced folders. This is where you're going to be setting up everything for you to use in terms of getting that sync going. Now, this tutorial is not intended to help you specifically with setting up your RetroArch on your device, be it a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus or just an Android phone. If you're looking for something, I again refer you to the great Retro Gaming Core. That channel is basically a bastion of content for folks trying to get into the retro gaming scene, and it has tutorials specifically on the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus if you're trying to set up that device. With regards to my configuration, what I did here is I again have the same folder for my syncs in terms of my saves as well as my save states. But again, what you end up doing is going to depend heavily on your own preferences. So I know some folks want to have each of their saves in a different folder for each game that they're playing. Some people like their saves to be sorted by the console that it belongs to. And so obviously this tutorial is going to differ in that regard. This tutorial is going to focus really on that ease of of installation, having everything in one folder, so that way you're really only syncing one folder. Maybe in the future I can go over alternative ways of syncing, but I'm primarily going to stick to this, mainly because one of the utilities I'll be talking about, Arklone, that's Arklone, that one, the default setting is for it to sync saves and to save states and saves in the same folder. With that said, I'm going to segue into talking about the 351 devices now. This includes 351P, V, which is the one I have, and I believe MP. If it's a device that uses 351ELEC or ArkOS, then this tutorial is for you. Now, when it comes to these devices, these AmberElec devices, there's a lot of variation because you could have different OSs, for example, right? As I just said, you could have not only different OSs, but different configurations for each OS you have. Right now, I actually have 2 SD cards where I swap between 351ELEC, which is now known as AmberElec, and I swap between that and ArkOS. So this guy's going to cover both OSs. Keep in mind, if all you want is the automatic syncing in the same way that Google Drive for desktop and AutoDrive sync automatically to the cloud, you're going to want to use ArkOS. ArkOS's Arklone has a functionality that lets you sync remotely. Now, I'm going to let you know, it was kind of hell setting it up. If you're familiar with Linux file systems and you're like comfortable digging into like ftab files and stuff, by all means, it's not that hard. But obviously, for folks who are like less familiar with that stuff, it could be intimidating, and it also comes with the risk of ruining your OS install. Now, obviously, this isn't a desktop. If you ruin your install, all you got to do is get another SD card. But I'm letting you know, just in case you want to have the option of doing something that's a bit simpler, even if it means foregoing the ability to have automatic syncing happen. So the next sections are going to be 351 first. We're going to go over some ways to basically allow you to remote into your device and manually put saves onto your desktop. It's pretty straightforward. And then the last section is going to be ArkOS, going into basically how you get Arklone up and running in a way that lets you remotely and automatically sync cloud saves to Google Drive. So assuming your 351 device is set up the way you want it, you're going to want to go into your settings for your 351ELEC or AmberElec install. You're going to want to check out the network settings specifically. These include whether or not SSH is enabled. Please enable that. Also enable Samba. Samba is how we're going to remote into our device and see all those folders on Windows. And then check your IP address. Make sure you have that down written somewhere so that you can type that in. And then once you're on Windows, you want to go to the network location wizard. This will allow you to create a location on your PC that basically is a shortcut to another location on your network. In this case, we're taking the Samba-enabled device, Samba-enabled 351 device, and creating a link to a specific folder and the SD card on that device. This is the ROMs folder I'm creating a link to. So using that IP address that we had from our system, we're going to create that link and then delineate a folder that we want to reference here, and that will create a permanent reference or shortcut on our desktop to that particular folder on the 351 device. Now, as I said before, this doesn't exactly give you automatic, autonomous remote syncing, but if you're comfortable with this, you can literally just, when your device is on, of course that's be on, you can literally just drag and drop any saves that you have and just deposit them onto your desktop. You could create a flow in which you manually sync your 351 saves to a desktop folder that's pushed to the cloud, or vice versa, what have you. But this is one way of enabling it without having to go through too much trouble. All you need is literally an IP address, a 351ELEC or AmberElec install, and turning on that Samba functionality on your device. And this is pretty simple to do. No fuss. Now we're going to move on to doing a more sophisticated solution. But before I go into that, I think I had to give you all some context on exactly what we'll be doing. So both 351ELEC, AmberElec, and ArkOS, these OSs have a utility called Arklone. This is spelled Rclone. This is actually just a utility that a lot of Linux file systems use to sync remotely to services in the cloud. Now, on your 351 or ArkOS device, Arklone by default does not have automatic syncing. What you have to do is you create a Arklone configuration file on your system, and then on your device within the Arklone utility, you have the option of pressing a button to manually back up your saves. The reason why I don't like this is, say I save my game and I turn off my system, forgetting to sync my saves, right? Then those saves will stay on my device. They won't be pushed to the cloud. I kind of just want it to be all automatic. And that for that reason, Arklone didn't appeal to me. Plus, Arklone does require you to create a config file. It's not hard, but even in the 351ELEC FAQ, they consider it somewhat of an intermediate to advanced solution. Again, not that it's hard, but it's obviously not as straightforward as using Samba or something like that. So I began looking into ways to automate this on my 351 device. Unfortunately, out of the box, there aren't any, especially true with 351ELEC and AmberElec. Those OSs really don't have any options. I talked to a few folks on Reddit, and I'll link to these threads in the description. A lot of people were just using custom scripts that I had written to do this, and obviously, going in and making scripts yourself, that's obviously more difficult than simply creating a config file for Arklone. So now we're like 2 steps removed from ease of use here. Then I noticed ArkOS has a custom script written by a guy known as Ridge. Now, Ridge had talked to the folks building ArkOS to see if he could have Arklone. And when I say Arklone, when I say Ridge's Arklone, it's actually a different spelling. This is sort of confusing, but Ridge was really clever in how they named the application they wrote. It's spelled Arklone, so they're phonetically the same. What I'm going to do in this video is when I refer to the original service Arklone, the utility Rclone, I'm going to say RC. And when I talk about Arklone, the thing that Ridge wrote, I'm going to call it AK because it's spelled Arklone. So hopefully you're following with me. So AK is basically a script that's written on top of the default RC utility inside of ArkOS. And what AK does is it actually has a functionality that lets you do an automatic sync. You don't have to manually remember to sync anything. Literally, it will be just like having Google Drive or having Drive Sync on your 351 device. It's autonomous. Now, setting this up is really hard because, first of all, it involves setting up RC, right? You got to have an RC script running in order for the AK script to run on top of that. And then you got to configure your ArkOS install in a way for AK to run effectively. So the next phases of this tutorial are going to be mostly dedicated to that. Now, mind you, since I just said that RC runs on both AmberElec, 351ELEC, and on ArkOS, you can take the advice from the next session where I set up my RC config and use that on your 351 device. Just keep in mind that RC by itself, which AmberElec and 351ELEC use, RC by itself does not give you automatic syncing. I think some of you don't care about that, and you're probably annoyed that I've been going or hamming so hard over this feature of automatic syncing, but I just want to make sure that I'm being very clear here, because I don't want people following the tutorial assuming they're going to get one thing and get something else entirely. So if you're fine with no automatic sync, I would just recommend you use the Samba setup in the last section, honestly. That's the most straightforward way to do this in my mind. You literally have folder icons on your Windows install. And Samba actually works on Mac too. I don't know exactly the steps you would do to set it up on Mac, but it probably is pretty similar. However you enable network devices on Mac is how you do that for a Mac install. But if you're looking for a way that is not difficult, that is manual, I would use Samba. But if you're so inclined, you could follow along next section and use RC instead after you create the RC config file that I'm going to walk you through in this next section. So the first thing you want to do to create your RC config file is to go to arklone.org, rclone.org. Once you're here on the site, navigate to the download section, and then select the respective version of Arklone for your particular operating system and hardware. I've got an AMD 64-bit Windows installation, so I'm choosing that corrective option. You've got options for Mac, Linux, and some other operating systems here as well. Once that's installed on our system, it's going to be a zip or archive. Go into the folder where the files are in your respective zip application, and I would copy those files into a folder on your desktop. Create a new folder basically called Arklone on your desktop. And I've done it here already. I'm now going into that folder in my Explorer, and then I'm copying that directory, that file directory. And so next, we're going to be creating our Arklone configuration file over the command line. Arklone only works with the command line. So once you activate the command line, type in CD, and once you've got CD up, type in CD, and then paste the directory that your Arklone configuration is in. Once you're there in the command line, you're basically inside the folder through the command line. You want to type in Arklone space config, Rclone space config. This initializes Arklone exe on the command line and allows us to set up our configuration file. So now that the options for the config file are up, the first thing you want to do is to press N for a new remote. I didn't do that here. I was deleting an older remote file. But when you press N, what should happen is it'll say no remotes found, make a new one. You want to press basically N to confirm. And once you've got that, once you confirm, you'll be asked to name your configuration file. So for those of you who are installing Arklone on ArkOS, it shouldn't really matter what you name the config file. But if you are doing this for AmberElec 351elec, I believe you have to name your remote file something specific. I will link to the directions about setting up this RC file in the description of the video. So just keep that in mind. So once we're done with that, the next step is to tell the installer what cloud service we're using or we're setting up Arklone for. You want to press 17. 17 is going to be your Google Drive. Don't use 18, which is Google Photos. Use 17, which is Google Drive. That's the Google Drive directory, and it's what you're going to be using in order to initialize Arklone for Google Drive. Now, mind you, if you want to do this for some other service, and you're free to do that, you could set it up for Dropbox, for example. But in this example, like I said, doing Google Drive. Now that we've got that initialized up and running, the next thing we're asked is for a client ID. Now, this is an advanced setting that is not really needed for this particular functionality. This basically allows you to make API calls, which is above and beyond what this tutorial covers. And we're going to be initializing Arklone on our own Google Drive account, so as an application. So we don't need this functionality at all. So we're going to skip it, and we're going to move on to the next item in the list, which is essentially determining the scope of Arklone, the scope of where Arklone will be operating. I chose 1 because I wanted to avoid having any problems of Arklone not having the correct permissions. It basically gives Arklone access to files across our Google Drive account. And since we own the Arklone configuration file, we're running the application, I feel comfortable doing that. But I guess it's up to you to decide how comfortable you are with that. I don't know exactly the minimum scope of permissions you can get away with giving Arklone. If somebody in the comments knows, you can comment that. If not, feel free to use a different method of syncing your files to Google Drive. So now the next thing we're going to do is to select what folder in Google Drive we want to have Arklone sync to. I would actually recommend skipping this particular segment and using the default, which should be blank. But if you're inclined to do so, navigate in a browser to the particular URL of the folder you want to use as your primary directory. You're going to copy the last part of the URL, like between the last two slashes. It'll be Google Drive slash, and they'll have basically a bunch of numbers and letters. That part of the URL is basically the folder ID for the directory that you're in. If you want to add that directory to Arklone, so Arklone sends the files to that directory, go ahead and paste it in the command line. Now, I don't recommend this method in part because AK, the script that is running on top of your RC config, the default behavior is to create a folder called Arklone, ARKLONE, in your Google Drive folder, or Google Drive directory, I should say. And the reason why that doesn't work out is because your saves are going to be inside that AK folder, which prevents them from saving to the directory that we created with RP2 Plus and Retroarch on our desktop. So I'm going to show you a different method for syncing if you're going to be using AK as one of your primary syncing services. I would recommend, as I said, not to put anything here in this folder ID. Leave it blank, and I will show you manually how to create a syncing system between all your devices if you're going to be using AK and RC as part of your syncing services. So the next item after the root folder ID is a service account file. This is a advanced Arklone feature that isn't relevant to us for this use case. If you want to know, it basically allows you to sync files autonomously on devices that don't have end users. So basically on like certain types of machines. Again, this is not relevant for this use case. So you can click the default option, press enter. Now, once you do that, what will come up is the option to do advanced configuration. You want to say yes to this. So type Y, and this will basically, the purpose of this is to allow us to create a token. For the next items on screen, you can actually just press the default options. I think they just press enter basically for the next few items on screen. Once you're done with all of this, Arklone will automatically begin setting up a configuration file, and then it will ping your browser. And in your browser, you'll see Google Drive open up with the account that should be your active account. All you have to do is authorize Arklone to activate on your account, and you should have a configuration file. So now that we have a RC config file, we're ready to set up AK, or Rclone's Arklone script. Unfortunately, Rclone's AK has a bug that prevents automatic syncing from happening on any partitions that are not FAT32. Most likely on your micro SD card, the partition where your ROMs are stored, I believe it's called EASYROMS, will be an EXFAT partition. We're going to have to reformat your SD card and change that to be a FAT32. This is a little convoluted because we're going to have to first tell the Linux file system that ArkOS uses that the EASYROMS partition is a FAT32, and then we're going to have to format the SD card. So first things first, there are two ways of doing this. One way, if you're familiar with how to activate ArkOS's terminal, because it is a Linux file system, you can actually go into the terminal and use the nano command to rewrite your fstab file. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm going to guide you through this. But there's an easier way to do this that I'm actually going to show on screen. And then in the next section, I'll teach you how to access the Linux file terminal, and you can come back and use that nano command if you want to. So the process for setting this up is twofold. Basically, step one is going to be, we're going to edit a file on your ArkOS install called a FSTAB. If you're familiar with Linux file systems, you should already know what this is. But basically, it's a text file that has a text record of the partitions on your installation system. So the partition linking to your ROMs has a record in this file. We're going to change that record to, say, FAT32 basically. When it comes to editing the FSTAB file in Linux, or FSTAB as I'm going to call it, you've got two options here. You can use the terminal on your ArkOS device to actually edit the file using the nano command. I won't actually go through this method. I'll show a little bit of it on screen, and I'll be going into more detail about how to use the terminal in the next section. If you feel comfortable doing that, this is technically faster. The method we're going to use is SSH. We're going to use SSH on our device in order to edit the file over the network. And this will be easier. Now, in order to use SSH, you're going to need to use what is known as an FTP client. We're going to use WinSCP for this, but you're free to use other ones like FileZilla, or if you're using a Mac, there might be a comparable program. Basically, this lets us use a GUI to actually access our files. But before that, in order to use SSH, our device has to be on. So turn on your ArkOS device. So next you'll be setting up Wi-Fi on ArkOS on our 351 device. Go to Options, basically, and Wi-Fi in the settings here, and then find your Wi-Fi name, basically your SSID, and then type in the password in order to effectively enable Wi-Fi on your device. And go to the settings of your device, navigate to the options, and within the options settings, you're going to want to choose a setting known as Enable Remote Services. And this will allow you to use SSH on your device while it's on. Now, every time you restart ArkOS, you're going to have to re-enable the setting. It's a security feature, basically. If you have SSH open all the time, technically anyone can remote into your device. Now, with that said, let's get the IP address for our device. You can do so in a section called Network Info of the Options menu of ArkOS, and get that IP address. And on our desktop, we're going to open WinSCP, and we're going to use the IP address that is on our network info within ArkOS and put that into the bar here of WinSCP. Where it says host name, we're going to put the IP address we got from our network info section of ArkOS. You can leave the port number the same. It should be defaulted to 22. That should be fine. For username and password, use Ark, A-R-K, and Ark, again, no caps, just lowercase a-r-k. With that, we should be able to SSH into our device. So the way that WinSCP or any other basically FTP client that lets you SSH into a device works is on the left side you've got your desktop or the file system that you're using, and then on the right side you've got the thing you're remoting into. So we're going to want to go on the right hand side to a folder called ECT. This will likely be if you press the very top folder and go to the home directory of your ArkOS device. You should be able to navigate all the way to where every folder is listed on your device. We're going to click on this arrow. We're going to go basically all the way to the directory where all the folders are stored. You should be able to then find ECT. Click on ECT, and then within this folder, you'll find the FSTAB file. Now you can click on the file and WinSCP or your FTP client, and then go down to the folder called ROMs. Change it from what it is to a VFAT. Now when you try and save, it will say that there is a problem. Click on retry, and that should actually work. I pressed retry here multiple times just to be safe, but basically it's going to keep giving you that error. You can click retry multiple times, or just click it once, and then you can exit the file. This should then, once you restart your ArkOS, have updated the FSTAB file. So the next step of the tutorial here, if you're going to be using AK, is to format your storage drive where your ROMs will be held into a FAT32 drive. If you have ROMs already stored on this drive, you're going to lose those ROMs, so make a copy of those right now and format the drive to a FAT32 drive. Now there are a ton of converters you could find online, or you might already have your own, but if not, I'll have a link in the description to the one that I used. Ironically, from a website called RidgeCorp, which has no relation to Rclone, who made AK. But anyway, grab your formatter and insert your drive into your computer so you can format it with a program. And once you reformat this drive, it will be blank. You can then re-add your EASYROMS folder directory back to this drive if you made a backup of those ROMs in the file directory structure. So that way you don't have to reformat it when you put it into ArkOS again. So once you have formatted this drive into a FAT32 drive, and once you've put your emulators and your file directory, your EASYROMS file directory back into the drive, you can then add your RC config file from way back in the tutorial onto the drive here, and I'll show you how to do that. So let's go back to the command prompt, and let's use the cd command that we used earlier to find our Arklone or RC folder. Once you've got that directory, cd space, and then the directory of where your Arklone exe file is on your desktop, you could then type in Arklone, Rclone, space, config, config, space, file, F-I-L-E. So this command, once you're in your Arklone exe directory, will pull up where your Arklone config file was created. You can copy the directory from the command line and enter it into your file explorer or whatever you use to navigate files across your desktop file system. Now once you've done this, open up another folder so you have two folders side by side, and navigate to your EASYROMS partition on your SD card. There should already be a folder on that partition called backup. If not, create that folder, and then within the backup folder, create another folder called Arklone, Rclone, and this is where you're going to paste your Arklone config file. On my screen, you'll see that I already have both the backup folder and the Arklone folder on the EASYROMS partition, but you'll likely not have this, so you'll need to create these folders and copy over the Arklone config. Next, you're going to navigate to a GitHub repo for Arklone AK, as I've been calling it in this tutorial, and navigate to the installation section of this page. So I will have a link to this page on the description of the video, but you can also Google for Ridgekun, RIDGEKHUN / ArkOS, and it should show up. But anyway, you're going to use the text here in the installation section of this page on your terminal on your 351 device, which I'll show you how to do in just a second here. So now I have my 351 device turned on. I'm going to be using a USB keyboard to type in commands in the terminal of this device. First, we'll need a USB-A to USB-C converter, which you can find online if you don't have one. You're going to want to plug this into your 351 device so that your keyboard is active. Next, we're going to go to the menu of the emulation station. We're going to quit the emulation station and we'll be greeted with a black screen. So next, we're going to press Alt and F2 together and now bring up the terminal. This is locked, so you need to use the user ID and password. Both are just ARK, A-R-K, and then press enter and A-R-K again. So this should bring you to the terminal. You'll be entering the commands that you saw on Ridgekun's GitHub repo for AK or Arklone, and you're going to enter each command line by line. So once you're done entering the first line, you'll enter the second line, you'll enter the next line. I'll be speeding this up so you can kind of briefly see what I've done here, but all you'll need to do is follow the installation instructions in the GitHub repo and type in those commands line by line, and Arklone or AK should be installed on your device. So now that we've installed Arklone, AK, let's boot ArkOS and go to Cloud Settings. There should be a new item on your options menu. This will initialize AK for the first time. You'll see a welcome prompt. Press yes. It's going to configure file structure for AK on your device. And then once these paths are generated, you'll be able to effectively see a bunch of options on the menu. I'm just going to fast forward this part. So once the AK file directory is set up, you should see the name of your RC config file. It'll say choose a remote, press yes. Now you're going to be at the AK menu. You've got a bunch of options. Number one is to assign a remote. We've already done that. Two is to manually sync files. That will be if you wanted to only run AK manually, but this tutorial obviously assumes that we want to set up completely autonomous or completely automatic syncing options. So we're going to go to option 3, and we're going to choose, basically, you have the option to choose how often AK automatically pulls save files from the cloud. Now, AK will detect changes to your file structure and push your saves to the cloud at regular intervals, but you also have the option to choose when it pulls saves from the cloud. I set this by default to only on boot because I don't want to waste power pulling saves to the cloud. The assumption for me is that I won't be running my 351 device concurrently with any other device. So there's no need for me to check if my saves have been updated in Google Drive while I'm playing my 351 device because I won't be playing on any other device until I turn off my 351 device. And as I said, AK checks for changes on your device in real time to push to the cloud, so you don't have to worry about that. This option is solely just for checking when to pull saves from Google Drive to your device. And then you can effectively exit the AK menu once you're done changing these settings and restart your device. So we're entering the final stretch here. The next step is going to be to SSH into our device again. This time you'll likely need to enable hidden folders on your FTP client. I'm using WinSCP for this again. So once you enable hidden folders, you're looking for a folder called .config. on the right side of your screen here. Once you're in the .config folder, you'll be able to see your RetroArch config files. We're going to want to change the settings in these RetroArch config files. We're specifically looking for settings called sort save states by directory and sort save files by directory. Once we find these two settings in the RetroArch configuration file, we're going to want to edit them to say false. What this does is it lets us to have save states and save files in one folder without having to have separate folders by game platform or anything like that. You're going to basically have everything end up saving in one folder. This makes it easier for you to effectively push the files and sync over the network. Now, this is optional, obviously, but if you're following this tutorial, if you don't do this step, you won't get your syncing happening exactly the same way I've done it in this tutorial. Just keep that in mind. So the last and final step is going to be to basically turn on your ArkOS device. If this is the first time you're turning it on since installing AK and setting it up, you'll see AK run. Basically, every time you turn on the device, AK is going to run and try and pull save files if you've configured the automatic sync to start on boot up. So open up a game, play it for a bit, try it and save if you can. Basically, you're trying to see if and where AK is creating save files. And if you set up your RC config file correctly, this should be going straight to your Google Drive. Now on your desktop, if you're mirroring your Google Drive directory to your desktop, you should find a folder in the Google Drive mirror called Arklone. That's Arklone. And this is the directory where your ArkOS saves will be showing up and will be available for you to sync to your desktop and other devices. So on your desktop, go to the Google Drive mirror and go to the Arklone folder and make this directory available offline. This will allow you to treat it like any other folder on your desktop. And then we're going to go to Retroarch, and we're going to make this our default saves and save state folder in Retroarch on our desktop. So this means when we play games on our desktop in Retroarch, it's going to default to saving to this Arklone folder, which is then going to be part of our Google Drive sync setup. Now, for those of you who were following the tutorial from the very beginning and you have a second device like a Retroid Pocket 2 or another Android device, you're going to kind of ignore the directions I provided at the beginning of the video because if you're using ArkOS and the 351 device, that's going to be your default hub. You can't use Retroarch as the place where your saves will sync because AK basically creates its own folder and directory. As far as I know, there's really no way to point AK at a folder on your desktop to Google Drive. You really can only make it your default folder or default place to sync. And so what I'm doing here is I'm making my desktop saves go to that Arklone folder in Google Drive, and then on my Retroid Pocket 2, I'm going to have that device actually sync to this Arklone folder in Google Drive as well. Even though in the Retroid Pocket 2 section of the tutorial, I showed myself doing something different. The assumption there is that most people only have one of these devices. Many people don't have both of these devices, but if you're someone who happens to have both of these devices, keep in mind you're going to undo that step and make Arklone, the AK folder in your Google Drive, the place where all your saves are going to go, including on your Retroid Pocket 2 or Android device. That pretty much concludes the tutorial. I will have a section afterwards going over commonly confused points and frequently asked questions. But in terms of the physical tutorial, this is the end. You've done all these steps. And if you've done them all correctly, everything should be working. So this section of the video is intended to be a postscript of sorts where I cover anticipated FAQs or questions people might have. I'm also going to use this section to clarify things that I don't think I covered very well in the video, So without any further ado, I'm going to just shotgun this. First thing is, obviously the tutorial is geared towards Google Drive, but you have a ton of other options. If you remember the RC section where I was creating the Arklone configuration file to use with AK, RC supports up to 18 plus services. Technically, you can configure it for custom services as well. So if you want to use it on like a personal like FTP server, say you have like a NAS or something where you want to send files to, you can do that. Keep in mind as well, the service I'm using on my RP2 plus, the Drive Sync. I think Meta Control is the company that makes it. They have a service for Dropbox and OneDrive as well, and RC supports those services, so you can actually follow the steps I outlined in this tutorial for Google Drive and just use OneDrive or Dropbox instead, and the features and the setup will be roughly analogous. I mean, obviously you won't be using Google Drive as your hub, but the steps are nearly identical. So feel free to use this tutorial for other cloud services. Just do your research in terms of what other solutions exist that help you kind of create that plumbing for you to send your files to the cloud. So second point, and I think I said this in the video, but maybe I should have said it more. In order for this to work, the cores you're using across all your devices have to be the same. So you can't go using, for example, Mupen for your desktop N64 ROMs and then use like a different service for N64 on a different device, right? So every core you use on every device has to be the same. If the exact core does not exist on your device, find the closest related core. So I think there's like 5 different versions of Mupen depending on what device you're running your Retroarch on. But obviously Mupen would be preferred compared to any other N64 emulator if you are running Mupen as the default emulator on your desktop, for example, right? So keep in mind cores need to be the same in order for you to be able to read and access your save files across devices. So point 3, if you're an advanced Linux user, you probably have way better options than AK. No offense to Rclone. Arklone and AK were lifesavers to me because obviously I don't have the skill to run my own Linux server, but or even just execute my own Linux scripts. But if you know even just a little bit of scripting, you could probably set up something way better than what I've done in this tutorial. And you won't be forced into using ArkOS. Not that ArkOS is bad, but I'm solely using ArkOS because AK doesn't work on any of the other 351 OSs. So, and that also goes doubly if you're gonna be working with, say, something like RetroPie. RetroPie obviously doesn't have any of these OSs. RC or Arklone, the non-Rclone version, exists on RetroPie, but you're gonna have to figure out scripting on your own. I did in the description include a link to a guy who claimed that he was running a script on his RetroPie that allowed him to do syncing, sort of like AK works on 351 devices. So you can check that out, but obviously you're kind of on your own in those scenarios. But I encourage you, if you have any skill set with Linux or you want to learn that stuff, there's a better way of doing this than what I've done in this tutorial. This is sort of like the jury rig version. So don't take this as the end-all be-all of making your save sync in the cloud. So last point here, regarding AutoSync for Android devices, this is a sync program I'm using for my Retroid Pocket 2. Normally, AutoSync's two-way sync works without any hitches. However, playing offline, I've occasionally encountered some situations where my saves were actually replaced with older ones. Basically, in those scenarios, AutoSync had pulled from the cloud, assuming that the saves made locally on my device are out of date. If this happens, AutoSync does not override any files, even if they have the same names. What it does is it changes the name of the older file it would have deleted. The file that it assumes is the out-of-date file. So you can actually, if this happens, go into your physical save folder and see which file was renamed. And if the renamed file is in fact actually newer than the file it's trying to replace it with, you just delete the file that you don't want and rename the save to the default name. And then AutoSync should actually send that to the cloud as if it were behaving normally. So this scenario actually is not that big of a deal. It may happen especially if you're, say, playing a game simultaneously on multiple devices, or say you're playing offline and you weren't able to join Wi-Fi for a while. It may just automatically, when you join a Wi-Fi network, start sending files from the cloud to your device, assuming that everything on your device is out of date. But normally this doesn't happen. It has happened occasionally. Just pointing it out, just as a FAQ, if something you encounter is weird here, this might be what happened. Anyway, with all of this out of the way, this video is officially over. If it was helpful in any way, give me a like. I spent some time on this. It was something that was important to me and hopefully of value to somebody out there. And take a look at my channel if you're interested. I don't really care if you subscribe, but a like would be nice so I know if video is useful. And thanks, everyone.